The useState hook is by far the most commonly used hook in React. In this tutorial, we'll examine the ins and outs of how it works, and by the end of the video, you'll have a clear understanding of this hook and how to implement it in your own code. Before we examine the implementation of useState, it's important to understand what state actually is in React. State is a huge part of React, and it's what allows React components to store their own data. Think of it kind of like storage, but for components. The main idea is that every component in React has its own state. This state is unique to that component. It can only be accessed within that component. How is state represented in React? In order to represent state, React gives every single component a state object. This state object is responsible for holding data for your component. For instance, maybe I wanted a piece of state in our component called count, and I wanted to start it initially at 0. If that's the case, in our object we could add something like count and with a value of 0. In this sense, every piece of state in React is a key that has a corresponding value to it, which can be an integer, a string, an object, or any other type of data structure. And I could have as many pieces of state as I wanted within a component, meaning as many keys in my object that I want. So maybe, for instance, I want to add another piece of state called URL. To do that, I could just say, URL, I have like a corresponding string. If I wanted to add, let's say, another one called API data, that's just maybe it's like an empty object for right now. The main idea is that we could have as many little pieces of React state as we want, and they're all part of this massive state object that is unique to every single component. So in this case, our component is just called test function, and we have a corresponding state values of count, URL, and API data within that component that are unique to this component. This is great for kind of showing you what the state object looks like, but we can't actually add state like this. So the question is, how do we actually add stuff to our state object? And that's exactly what this useState hook is for. Every time we call the useState hook, we can add some piece of state to our state object. Let's now look at how we can actually do that. The first thing we need to do before ever using useState is to import it from React. In most IDEs, it'll actually do an autofill, so if I type like import, I can start typing useState like this, and then you'll see autofills here, and I can go ahead and press enter like this, and it'll actually import it automatically from React. If you don't import it and you try to use it, you'll get an error on your page. Let me go ahead and just delete this here, and I'm going to make space up here. So now the question is, how does this useState function work? So useState basically works like this. useState adds something to our state object. In addition to just adding state to our object, it also returns exactly 2 values every time it is called. The first return value is always the actual piece of state that you just created. And then the second return value is just the setter function for that piece of state. Just so it's clear, I'll just write return here and then return here as well. In order to capture those 2 returned items, we can use what's called array destructuring, and this will always be the way you're going to use this. So to do this array destructuring to capture these 2 return arguments, we need to write const and then square brackets to do our destructuring, and then now we can access and name the 2 return values. Our first return value, as I just mentioned, is our actual piece of state or our state variable. So for right now, I'm just going to call it count. And then our second return value, as I just mentioned, is our setter function for count. It is standard practice to have the setter function as set, and then whatever your state is. So in our case, we would name it like set count, like this. And then all we need to do to actually capture these outputs from useState is do equals, and then let's call useState like this, and make sure we call it as a function. And again, this is returning 2 variables, which we are just capturing via array destructuring. Array destructuring just captures the return values of a function in order. So in this case, useState, as I mentioned, is returning these 2 things. This first piece of return here, this piece of state, we're naming count. And then this second return here, we are just naming set count. And one final thing with this line, useState always accepts 1 argument here. And this argument represents the initial value of your state. So for right now, let's just start our count at 0. So we'll just go ahead and put 0 inside these parentheses here. What this line has essentially done here is added a piece of state to our state object. So now our state object would technically look something like this. So we would have like a variable count in here that would have the initial value of 0. And it's initialized to 0 because we passed in 0 right here. And then, as I mentioned, this key value is going to be equal to whatever value we have here, which is the first value of our array destructure. And then this second one, again, is the setter function, which I will actually go over in just a moment. And now, every time we call this line, we're going to add something to our state object. So for instance, let's add another piece of state here. Let's say I want to add a piece of state. I'm just going to call it like URL. And then we'll have our setter function be set URL. And then we'll just initialize it to an empty string here. And basically what this has done in our object is added another variable called URL and just set it to empty string. Maybe I wanted a piece of state that could hold some object, so I could just like take this again, if I can actually get it, copy and paste it, and it's like, we'll just say API data, and like set API data, and we can just maybe initialize it to an empty object, which is essentially just adding another thing in our state here that just says API data with an initial value of an empty object. Hopefully now you get the picture of what I'm trying to get across. Each time we call this useState function here, we want to use this notation which just captures the two return values from useState, the first value being the name of the state variable and the second value being the setter function for that state. When we call the useState function, we can pass in an argument that represents the initial value that we want that state to be initialized to. By calling the useState function 3 times using this notation, we've essentially filled our state object with 3 different values. Now in our code, we can freely access this state however we want. We could do so in our JavaScript code by just referencing the name of the state variables, or we could do so in JSX by doing the same thing but just using curly brackets. So for instance, if I wanted to see like count on our page, I could just type count like this, save it, and now you see count is on the page. So now you know how to actually use the useState function and now access our state wherever we want. Okay, so we've initialized our state and we have it now, but the point of state is that it should be able to change whenever you want it to change. So how do we do that? Well, that's exactly what our setter functions are for, like setCount, setURL, and setAPIData. If I, for instance, wanted to set the count variable to something, I can't just do like count equals something like this. I have to instead actually call this setCount function. So for instance, if I wanted to set count to 2, instead of saying count equals 2, what I would instead do would be setCount2 like this. Or for instance, maybe I wanted to take this URL here and I wanted to set it to a string that just has none in it. I could just call setURL and make it a string that just says none like this. Now let's examine these setter functions a little bit deeper. So for now, I'm actually going to go ahead and delete these other pieces of state here, just so we just have the count to deal with, just so it's easier to kind of get across. So we have a count variable now that is part of our React state, and we want to change it. One way to do this would be to make an event in our JSX. So let's actually go ahead and just make a button down here. I'm going to say button like this. And then inside this button, all I'm going to write is increment count. Go ahead and save it. And now you can see on our page, we have our count and it says increment count. And actually, let's go ahead and make this, let's change this to like header 2 for right now. So it looks a little bit cleaner. Go ahead and save it. And now we have header 2 as count. And then we have a button that says increment count. Now inside of our button, let's pass in an onClick event. So let's go ahead and just write onClick like this. And this is how you're going to pass in onClick events to any sort of JSX tags. And inside the onClick, all I want to do is call setCount. So I'm going to write function notation like this. I'm going to call setCount. And then let's pass in the current count, which is just count plus 1 like this. So basically what this does is every single time this button is clicked, we are calling this setCount function, which increments our count by 1 by passing in the existing count plus 1. To test this functionality, we can go ahead and click on our button and notice every single time we click it that our count variable is incrementing with every single click. Each time this button is being clicked and we are calling the setter function here, we are updating our state object here. So for example, we said count starts at 0. So when I click it for the first time, then it goes to 1. I click it again, it gets updated and goes to 2. Click it again, it goes to 3. And hopefully you get the picture. One thing I want to point out is that useState only runs right when the component is first rendered, and it doesn't run after that because we don't need to initialize state more than once. However, if I just go up here and I refresh the page, we are basically unmounting and then remounting the component entirely, meaning its state is wiped out and set back to its default value, that being 0. So anytime a component is unmounted, whether through a refresh or some other event, the state is wiped out of that component. This is usually the intent you want with state because a component unmounting means you won't need that pre-existing state anymore. There are a couple of ways to get around this if you absolutely have to, but that's a whole other topic for another time. Let me quickly clarify one thing that I went over a moment ago. So normally in programming, if you ever want to change a variable, you can simply reassign that variable. Like if you wanted to change count to equal 5, we could just say count equals 5 like this. React state doesn't work this way, and I'll show you exactly why that is. So to go ahead and show you this, I'm going to go ahead and delete this here. And then instead of calling setCount using our setter function, I'm actually just going to do something right here. I'm going to say count equals count plus 1 like this. And now let's save it and let's see what happens. Let's try and click our button here. And it looks like every time I click it, nothing is happening. It's actually just staying at 0. But if I Control Z this and go back to having set count of count plus 1 and I do it, now it suddenly works. Now, why is this? The reason why you need to use a setter function to update the state is because the setter function tells the React DOM that a re-render needs to happen. So every single time a setter function is called, the component that it's called in completely re-renders so that it can show the updated state correctly. If I just did something like count equals count plus 1 like this without using a setter function, our state actually is being updated, but because we're not calling a setter function, React doesn't know that we're updating state and thus doesn't show any change on the page by re-rendering. So TLDR, anytime you want to change a state variable, whatever it may be, you want to use the setter function you declared for it if you want the state to behave properly. Let's now look at a couple more examples of implementing useState in our code. In our first example here, we have a text box, and then inside this text box, we can type literally whatever we want. And then right below the text box, we have a thing here that says you typed, and then it displays whatever we type within the text box. Now let's run through our code to see how this actually works. First, we've declared a piece of state called text with the setter function of setText. By default, we made this variable equal to an empty string. In our input field here, which represents our actual text box, we have this onChange property here that just accesses the event of a user typing and then calls our setTextSetter function to set the text to whatever the user has typed. And notice right below this field, we have an h2 tag that is just printing out our text state. What this onChange function does here, this onChange property, is every single time anything in this input field over here changes, whether it's me adding, deleting, or changing a letter, it's going to call this setText function and keeps updating the text in real time. So every single time anything happened in this text box, the component is re-rendering. So for instance, if I start it from here and I type A, then the component is going to re-render because it's going to call this setText function. If I say B, it's running it again here. If I delete something, it's running it again too. Basically, every single time anything changes, we are running this function here, which again is just calling the setText method. In our next example here, let's look at a piece of Boolean state. In this example, we have a piece of state called isOpen with the setter function of setIsOpen. We're using true to initialize our isOpen variable to be true. In our code here, we have a button that has an onClick property. Inside this property, we're just setting our isOpen state to the opposite of what it currently is. So for example, if isOpen is currently true, then this statement here will be setting it to false. If it is currently false, then this statement here will be setting it to true. And this only works because isOpen is a Boolean value when it's being initialized. And notice we have a conditional operator here. So our button's text changes depending on what the state says. So when isOpen is true here, we're going to display close the gate. Whenever it is false, we're going to display open the gate. And then below all this, we have an h2 tag here, or header 2, that just says the gate is, and then its value will depend on what isOpen is equal to. So if isOpen is true, it'll say open. If isOpen is false, it'll say closed. When the page first renders, useState initialize isOpen to true, meaning the JSX is going to say the gate is open here. And then inside of our button, it'll say close the gate because isOpen is true. To test this out, we can click on this button here. We can click close the gate, and now it says the gate is closed. And now we have an option to open the gate. Now it says the gate is open, and we could just repeat this process as many times as we actually wanted to. Let's look at one last example. And in this scenario, let's look at an example where we have more than one piece of state to work with. In our last example here, we have a couple of things that you can see right away. So we have a text box here. We have a button that does some stuff, and then we have a header tag that also displays some stuff. And we also have two pieces of state up here. We have one called name, which the setter function is setName, and we're initializing that to an empty string. And then we have another piece of state called age with the setter function of setAge, and we're initializing that to be 0. Inside of our code, we have functionality that we've seen just a moment ago. We have an input field where we can type some stuff in, and that input field has an onChange event. Every time any text in the field changes, we are updating our name state to be equal to whatever is currently in the text field. And you can see in our header tag down here, every time we type something in our box here, that is displayed in this header tag. So if I type like, let's say Ryan, for instance, now you can see it says Ryan is 0 years old because we're accessing name in our header. And then like you saw a moment ago with our count variable, we're using a button to increment some state. In this case, we have a piece of state called age. So it starts at 0, and then every single time I click this button, it's now going to increment the age by 1. The text box is meant to update my name however I want by using setName, and then this button here is meant to increment the age by every time I clicking it, calling the setAge function. And like usual, whenever we want to access any JavaScript variables, especially React State, we want to make sure if we're doing it inside JSX that we're using curly brackets like this, because otherwise if we didn't do curly brackets and we just said name, it would think we're saying name literally and just type name. So just make sure we always have curly brackets so it can access the state correctly. And that's going to wrap up this video. If this helped you learn the useState hook, please consider liking the video and subscribing as it helps out tremendously with the YouTube algorithm. Hope this helped and have a great rest of your day.